starts becoming quite intriguing. So the age one is the next one that we look at. Again, we're using the stats categories. The only thing that I do here is I put the ones that are way old, that are older than 86, I throw them all together, because sometimes when that figure becomes so small, it becomes misleading. The stats actually can lie to you, can tell you there are people that, which there aren't, 120-year-old people. It's a statistical phenomenon. So what you need to look at when you see an age profile like that is, in particular, what are the proportion of people that are in the group between 16 and 35, or at least younger than 35 years old. And internationally, in demographic terms, if that group is expanded, it refers to the youth bulge. Now, the youth bulge is a very interesting thing. That's a normal population pyramid, okay? The youth bulge, and that's ages. So a youth bulge would mean that that lower section would be bigger. It would look something like this. Like the Egyptian one, okay? There's the Egyptian pyramid, and it shows a youth bulge. And one of the most common explanations for the conflicts in Egypt at the time that I did this was using the notion of a youth bulge as an explanation. It indicated that you have in that country a lot of young people that are relatively well educated but are unemployed and are marginalized out of the system. And so they become a potential source of conflict in society. Interesting difference, of course, with South Africa is that this is our youth bulge. And interesting that it looks very similar to the Egyptian one, isn't it? But there's a critical difference with the Egyptian profile that I just described. Eh, Jeff? There's an obvious difference, isn't it? Education factor. So you've got the same profile, where in the Egyptian case, you have an educated but frustrated youth. In our country, you have a non-educated but frustrated youth. And it makes for different ways of dealing with that problem. But you've got to know this. And you've got to look at your particular communities to see where I've got this particular phenomenon. And then start looking at social programs and educational interventions in terms of dealing with it. We're still in Ward 33. We're looking at the age profile. Now we're going to educational attainment. Again, the whole list of all the different categories familiar to you, Isaac. All the different educational categories are there, and every one is put in a number and a percentage. But it's confusing if you look at it like that, isn't it? You need to make some sense out of that. So what I do is I say, let's throw together all of those that are, broadly speaking, the category of those who have finished high school, grade 12, and anything equivalent to that or more. And then I'll build an indicator around that. And then you've got a specific figure that you can use, and you can compare the different areas with one another. So in that context, in Vale, 9.6% of people having completed high school or anything equivalent to that or more. And I can compare that with another ward in which you find 50 to 60% with a figure like that. Now you can refine it in different kind of ways. You can say, like I did with the Summerstrain study recently, I did an analysis that only looked at those people older than 20 years old and asked the question, how many of them have completed high school or more? And that gives you a figure that is probably more significant because the other figure includes those that are still in school. So you work with, and so over time you become more and more sophisticated so now you look at employment status, and again, confusing potentially, because we know in South Africa we have multiple definitions of employment and unemployment, particularly unemployment. You define it in many different ways. You can define unemployment in terms of those who are out of work, but are actively seeking work. Okay? That gives you a certain figure. You can refine that by, and that figure typically corresponds with an age group. And that age group is also not always consistent. Some people would say from the age of 16 to the age of 60 or 65. Or they would say from the age of 18 to the age of 60 or 65. It all depends on which one you use. Or you can say, I'm looking at those that are actively looking for work in these age categories, plus those who are discouraged. And that is an interesting thing that has become part of unemployment analysis in South Africa, because so many people have tried to get jobs and then they give up. But that doesn't mean they should not be counted as unemployed. They're part of that category. Same thing with household income. There you've got a list of figures. You've got to make some meaning out of it. You've got to work out what is poverty. How do you define poverty in the South African context? Now you can't just define poverty with reference to income. Poverty is deprivation in a broader sense of the word. That's how I see it as a sociologist. But even if you just use an income figure, where's the cutoff point that you use? And you know, the government will use this figure, this agency in the government will use that figure, that development agency uses another one, so it's very confusing. But you've got to somehow have a cutoff point. I have, for the purposes of the analyses that I have done, I have used a cutoff point in this table, in which I say households that earn less than 800 Rand per month income. That's very low, okay? But it at least gives me something to compare with. I am not making a statement about how I define poverty with it. All that I'm saying is that's a figure that I use to show you how in some areas there are many families that fall into that category and how in other areas there's virtually none. Let me take a step back to the unemployment one to just show you how dramatic the comparative statistics become. The official unemployment figure, that is now the one that's the narrow definition, is the one that I'm using here. Okay? So I'm not complicating things for the moment for comparative purposes. You look at the top ones there, the suburbs that I referred to, the Ward 1, the Ward 2, the one where Walmer is, Newton Park, Parsons Hill, Lorraine, Sunridge. The unemployed figure is that, can you see where I'm at there? Can you see? Can you see that we are talking about unemployment figures that are in the top one, as low as 2.47% unemployment? It's nothing. It's in European, North American terms, it's not unemployment. So you can pull that through and you can look at all these comparable communities and you see unemployment figures as low as that. And it alerts you to the fact how concentrated deprivation and poverty and things like unemployment are in certain areas and how hugely contrasting it is with other areas. We're a very, very unequal society and it's still very patterned and structured in that kind of way. Sure.
Obviously, when I'm looking at it, and I pass into, and I do get some qualification, and I start to earn,
yes,
then I actually move out of Gelvandale, and then I become one of the people in some Australia.
That's true. That's true.
And
good observation.
Somebody that's there, that is losing his job, moving down, is going to have to.
And that exacerbates, makes that figure stay bad.
Yeah.
That's true. I mean, if if you're upwardly mobile, you move into the areas where your upward mobility allows you to access money. Yes.
Just looking at the Ward 1 stats there for unemployed.
Yes.
If a person is retired and you ask him a question, are you employed? And he says no, would they count it as a stat?
No. If you look at this unemployment figure refers to those who are actively busy seeking work. It excludes those other categories. Yes. That's the official, there's an official definition within certain age group actively seeking for work, and more recently we've added those who have been discouraged to that definition. Okay, so back to household income, we must know what we're talking about, and this information, in my view, is still difficult information to interpret because people have all kinds of other forms of income. There's an informal economy. There's all kinds of other dimensions to our economy that makes it very difficult to really pin down a household socio-economic status. But there are measures that are being used in the country. For instance, the LSM figures that are being conducted, that are done by, you know what I'm talking about? LSM, lifestyle measurement that puts all South Africans into 10 categories, and it's done by the South African Advertisement or Advertising Agency or Association, something to that effect. Widely used in South Africa, particularly to do market analysis, almost uncritically used. I did studies in which I compared those categories with my own on-the-ground research and with Stats SA. Stats SA confirms my on-the-ground research, which I trust because I've been in that particular community, and it differs hugely from the LSM accounts. Yeah, hugely. And there are decisions that have been made in this city based on those figures for major developments that turned out disasters. And it comes back to the point that we are not making enough of an effort to get local information. We're trusting aggregates. You know, LSM figures are based on aggregates for studies on a macro level. And it's based on samples, and sometimes those samples are a little bit suspect. So let's just be careful to simply assume that those kinds of figures and analyses are actually reliable for our purposes. So, you know, particularly in certain parts of the city, this is the kind of information that people are very interested in. The nature of dwellings, nature of the houses that people live in. And I'll run through that. You want to look at that?
That's because something.
Sure.
You see now that they made decisions on doing property research.
Yes.
I mean, most people
don't.
Even wars sometimes, because they don't have proper information, they create world wars. What are they doing about getting proper research? Because I mean, if you don't have the proper research, how can you?
You know, often,
because
to illustrate to you, let's be a little bit more specific. I'm talking about major shopping malls that were developed in the city that turned out to be disasters. There are two there in a particular part of the city, and there's a drama around those.
Yeah.
You know how the feasibility studies of those were done? They were done by people from Cape Town that used this aggregated figures for this city, assuming that this city is similar to other metros in South Africa. Now I can tell you one thing, that the research that I did on the demographic analysis of the city confirmed a few very interesting things about the city that makes it unique. We like to say we're unique, and I don't like to get on that because we are South Africans. Often go on too much about how unique we are. But let's identify certain uniquenesses when they are there and work with them. We are the slowest growing from a demographic point of view metro in South Africa. We, with the Northern Cape, are the only two provinces in South Africa that actually lose people, net loss of people. What happens in the city, in relation to the province, is that you have the typical phenomenon of urbanization, as has happened throughout the ages in all countries. People move from rural areas, they come to urban areas, they're in search of work. Our rural areas are running empty of people. There's a crisis in the rural areas, there's a crisis in agriculture in this country. People flock to cities assuming that there are jobs in the industries. They come to Port Elizabeth. The Port Elizabeth industrial sector is on a huge decline. They don't get jobs here. The statistics actually tells you where people come from. This is not speculation. You can actually see where the person's previous province of residence was and when did they leave. So you can see a pattern of people leaving this province, initially settling. It was the pattern for quite some time to settle in the Western Cape. Now the Western Cape is not providing enough job opportunities. People go directly from here and they go to Gauteng. So Gauteng is a major growth center on the basis of people that come in from other provinces. Now you start asking questions about why that is the case. You know, why do people move on like that? And that comes back to the lack of economic growth that we spoke about earlier. But what it also says to you is that we have a certain uniqueness in terms of expected growth. We expect like we will grow like any other center in South Africa, but we don't. We don't grow from the bottom up, and we don't grow in the middle class.
Maybe a lack of leadership there.
Well, no, it may be that, but it's much more hard-nosed economic stuff. Your middle class doesn't find the city attractive. They get educated at the university. They're ambitious young people. They're looking for something. They leave. As I say, my children are part of that demographic phenomenon. And there are many. I did studies of that kind for the university while I was at the university. So there's an exit of talent. And as long as you also don't have, and that's why we need ambitious, interesting projects as well, besides the community economic stuff that I spoke earlier, you need those fascinating, challenging projects because they pull again. They like a honeypot that pulls talent from other parts of the world into your city. Now again, we don't have it. We have a minimal trickle-in of people into a few major developments, way too little to have the typical middle-class growth. And in the black community, we're talking about black diamonds in South Africa. The black diamond phenomenon almost doesn't exist this for this. And if you're going to do market analysis and you're going to design shopping malls and you cater for that group, you're missing the target. You're heading for failure. And that we've seen the evidence of. So these are things that are things like, you know, as I say, if you go through that list, you'll find things like energy for fuel, for cooking, and for light, and so on. Toilet facilities. This one is one that people asked me to look at because of the bucket system, and then you see where it's still concentrated in certain parts of the city. And then the cell phone thing, the access to computers. And I'm going to come back to that because I want to quickly illustrate, and that will hopefully be my roundup. I'm going to just talk about briefly about some of the applications that use this information. The first thing that I did was, that I could refer to, is the study that I did. Where is that one now? Did I close this one? There you go. I did a study in Utenay Dispatch, which was the first study ever done in this metro where you had not just a focus on a particular population group. It it was across the spectrum. All the different sub-areas of youth native space were included in the study. Okay? And what I found was some amazing patterns with regards to how people's socio-economic fortunes contrast in that particular area. So you had areas that were historically and predominantly black, historically and predominantly colored, historically and predominantly white. Okay? And so I analyzed the patterns in and amongst those different areas. And what I found was I could cluster together certain socio-economic variables that consistently featured for particular types of areas at particular levels. So there was a correspondence in terms of certain trends across the board with certain variations in those categories. And as I started analyzing that further and further, and this is the analysis that I did there, and I came to the point of trying to make sense of the pattern, and I used the concepts of a virtuous and a vicious cycle to explain that. And what I firstly found was that in the historically white areas, I found what could be described as a virtuous cycle. In other words, a cycle of relative prosperity that keeps on reproducing itself. In other words, a community that originally has limited experience of deprivation, and then a certain set of variables kick in and complement one another in a certain analytical relationship to one another. In other words, they tend to also have high levels of formal education attainment, low levels of unemployment, relatively high levels of household income, low levels of dependency on the state, and as a consequence, a reproduction of the relative affluence. And I'm simplifying it in order to make the point to people that these things relate to one another in a particular way. There are many other variables that come into the picture. So it's an analytical picture which really becomes more interesting when you look at the vicious cycle. And that is the kind of pattern that have been confirmed to the extent that is really amazing. In the lower socio-economic areas of the city, where you have a history of inherited poverty and deprivation, and a predictable pattern in communities of limited or no money or even limited motivation to pursue formal education, leading to high levels of dropout, which we spoke about earlier. Bringing this dropout figures into that limited levels of school attainment, high school completion, and very small numbers of tertiary level education qualifications. The next thing is unemployability. You've got to bring in the concept of unemployability, not just unemployment. What people have in order to be employed regardless of their education level. High levels of unemployment as a consequence of that, inevitably low levels of household income, and consequently high levels of dependency on state grants. And if you don't break that cycle, that's the point. If you don't break that cycle, or you think you can deal with that cycle by making your intervention there, you're not going to solve the problem. Because that dependency phenomenon has a build-up that comes from there. So you've got to break the cycle at some point earlier before you end up in the trap of reproducing your own poverty and deprivation. So it's been going on, that pattern, the statistics, the people that started looking at this, is saying this is now a 20-year cycle. We've been wheel spinning for 20 years. We've been reproducing this same pattern. And the challenge to us is to ask the question, how and where do you break that? And that's where the education people and so on, I'm going to give you a chance in a moment, that's where the whole debate about absolute importance of education at a foundation level, and things like health and basic needs, where those things at a basic level becomes critically important. Because if you don't break it here, If you don't break the cycle somewhere there, that this thing needs to become more complicated. But the point that I'm making is there are primary factors, and there are factors that build on the primary factors. And eventually it becomes an avalanche that reproduces itself. It's a tremendous challenge to our leadership and to our policymakers to make that kind of intervention at the right place and at the right time. And they need to be made in a specific community. I can give you those exact figures. I can tell you how many people are out of work in this particular community. We can actually have a concrete figure, not a percentage. We can build a program around that. We know how many people have dropped out. They are sitting out of the system. We can go get that information, contemporary people living in this community, not the people that have left. The ones that are here now, we have the information. And I'm not saying it's the only information that we need to use. I'm saying there's another level of information closer to the human being that we need to go and get. But why do we ignore this? Because it gives us that bigger picture. Yes, sir.
Yeah, you're talking about breaking the cycle.
Yeah.
Now, it seems like we have to, how do you change people's behavior? Because every day people go to work.
Yeah.
Out of their summer they go to work. They come back at the end of the month. We have us millions of rands, but the next day we go and we will spend it somewhere else. So how do we break that cycle where people spend the money where they're staying?
Well, you know,
because we're spending our money somewhere else, and that's why we're staying poor.
That's the earlier point that I made about community economies. And they need to have incentives for that. They need to have policies that drive us in that direction. If you're going to leave it to the marketplace, then no one's going to start those businesses here. But you need to have incentives. That's why we need to have, and we have incentives for everything in this country. There's a fund for everything. But are we using those funds in a developmentally meaningful way? That's one of the ways in which I say it can be used meaningfully. Is to say, here we have identified a whole range of needs that are not being satisfied in this particular community. Okay? Can we then build around that a support system for people that are interested in starting at the lower end, getting into that sector of the economy, supporting them, helping them with, and the models are there. The models are over the world in terms of how you support people at that level. Go to Bangladesh, go to India, go to South America. We have models that comes out of our ears in terms of how to get local economics going by putting the right kind of support there. But we somehow not doing that. And I'm saying, stop pointing the finger at the government. I'm saying, put these agencies together ourselves. Can we not find ways at a community level, instead of keeping on and saying to the government, you're not channeling the monies in the right kind of way, can we not get the agencies together that say to the government, okay, you're making that money available, come. We've got an intermediary, and we've got models for that as well. Intermediary organizations that position themselves between the community and the government agencies. And we will become your conduit. We will channel them, and we will monitor, and we will advise. The models are there. Right? They're there. CEDA is an example of such an organization. Are they making enough impact?
When you talk about having information available, you often hear how government spends a lot of money on consultants in the course.
Yes.
And they often talk about consultation with people.
Yes.
Even though sometimes the day before,
Yeah.
they make the announcement you'll need that community.
Yes.
But what's said is that it seems that a lot of the decisions have already been made. No matter what information you can even supply. So the issue of the availability of information, it sometimes baffles a person. That they have access to it, they engage consultants like you, and you've worked even for the Metro, and I wonder what happened to a lot of that information. So it all appears the government same question.
Yes.
But there's one about the availability. The other issue is just when you talk about local economic development. until we find that everything else that's on the other side is green pastures, it's not going to change.
I agree
The
with
first thing our leaders do is move out of the communities. Our children go to another school. We can't in our own mind see that we can develop a school of excellence in the northern areas. Because we must find it somewhere else.
That's it.
And unless we break that barrier, it's not going to change. And there will demographics will always
Absolutely. I agree with that.
I think it's also a mindset.
Yeah.
We grow up with that mindset and poverty becomes the mindset. And I come from this community. I grew up here. When I compare myself with guys that have grown up here and stayed here, moved into the backyard of their parents' homes, and now owning that home and still being a true room because that's where I grew up, then I can see the difference in the mindset, because the mindset is what actually keeps the person defined.
Something that I took out of my presentation had to do with as a sociologist, my preoccupation with the human being. And my realization in much of what's going on in our society is that we don't look at people as human beings. We look at them as categories. We have an over-socialized concept of the human being. So we deal with everyone in a particular category, but we also tend to see ourselves in social categories. We tend to think that label that the society has put on us, we can't escape from. And there is not enough happening in our society to help people to discover their human being. You know? So that's another challenge that you put to a church and to a school community and to other support agencies. You ask them, what are you doing in order to not get that individual to play the game of the day, to go along with everyone to do what is the popular thing to do? What are you doing to get that person to understand who they are and work out a personal modus operandi to survive and to make a decent living, to find your place in the world? We're not paying attention to it. We're leaving it to the fact that a person must fit into some category, and then the recipe for behavior and action will somehow come. That doesn't happen. So we have a lot of work to do, I think, on that psychological, that human level in our society. We are neglecting that in our society. We're talking about one another in policy terms, about categories of people, and we're making generalizations and stereotypes about people. We're not asking, who are you and what's your situation? And as long as we don't do that, that particular individual is never fully empowered, can never really move from where they find themselves. They feel trapped. We reinforce that label, and they feel they eventually, their behavior is a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's the stuff that I taught you when you were in sociology. Self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay, I'm quickly going to try and wrap up, and then we can talk again. Okay. The other very interesting thing that I found in another area that's quite provocative. We have a city in which we have a lot of xenophobia and attacks and conflicts with regards to immigrants. Okay? I was approached by the police in the city. They wanted to know certain things about the socio-economic dynamics, and they wanted me to help them explain causal relationships. In other words, what leads to the formation of gangs, what leads to this, and what leads to xenophobia, and so on. Do you have variables that you can analyze that can help us understand that? Wow. Fascinating question. And so what I did, I started looking at this kind of comparative tables, and I categorized my socio-economic variables. Again, I was looking at how they relate to one another. And I looked at how certain basic socio-economic variables like education, like income, like age, and so on, how they form a certain kind of package. And how another set of variables that has to do with things like service delivery, your quality of life, your level of satisfaction about the environment that you live in, even things like flooding and so on, how those kinds of things relate to one another. And then I ask the question, if I find in a particular area a high occurrence of immigrants, and in addition to that, there's a particular low frequency of local economic activity in that area. If I find those variables to link with one another, can I predict that there will in a particular area be a xenophobic occurrences? And to my astonishment, I predicted it correctly. Not in all cases, and not everywhere where I predicted it happened, but the cases where it happened, it showed that kind of line. How you can take a certain set of socio-economic, service delivery related type of variables, quality of life variables, economic activity, and then you bring in a factor of people that pose a threat to people in that kind of environment. And that's the potential for conflict. The last thing, can I perhaps talk about NAF and our Vodacom? Can I talk about that? The last a recent piece of work that I did, working with Billy, we looked at corporate social investment, and Northern Areas Festival wants to get Vodacom to make an investment in their program. They sort of respond, and I'm not necessarily correct in every way that I portray it, Billy, but their response is, no, of course we will, but give us something meaningful to respond to. Okay? They're not quite playing the game. They're playing hardball. And yet it's interesting that the same Vodacom does almost not have a presence in this part of the city. They have a limited market penetration. What it says to one is, did Vodacom perhaps give up on this part of the city? That they think, I'm not interested in just putting my brand out there. I want something that's going to sell my product. And so it becomes a challenge to us. And so what we do is we start analyzing the profiles of the local communities. And I take the different boards and of these areas, and I pick up the trends. And the one that's very interesting in particular is, if I can just find it quickly, it's that one. We find that, yes, you've got all these patterns of socio-economic deprivation and so on, which is similar and corresponding in most of the areas. But then you have a particular, very interesting phenomenon that when it comes to something like cell phones, access to cell phones, like the pattern is throughout the poorer areas of the city, we find that that figure is right up there, in line with international standards. I mean, I did a study now in South Australia, and I found a 95% cell phone access in some Australia, or in Ward 1, or in Ward 2. And at one point, my statistics was going haywire, and it seemed as if that figure was much lower. And I spoke to the client, and I said to them, I'm finding something astonishing here, that people in New Brighton have more cell phones than people in some Australia. And I said, this is going to be, one mind-boggling revelation here. That I did. Unfortunately, my stats were wrong, and it proved that, in fact, they had 95% access. And then the client says, wouldn't it have been a major revelation if we found that Summerstrand is less connected than, for instance, New Brighton? And I said, hey, Oppas, it's not what you think. Don't underestimate the connectivity in those areas. And so I picked out some of the figures, and I showed them that there are a number of wards in the city that have 97, 98% cell phone access, and they're not the affluent suburbs. They're the motherwells. Okay? So the whole cell phone thing is fascinating in our society, and it's become one that connects people in lower socio-economic areas where you don't have access to landlines, and you use the cell phone for many different and important things in your existence. However, and then now we come back to Manuel Lascelles, the famous Spanish social scientist who wrote a book about the network society, and he said, the new society, the global community, the global society is a network society. And it's the technological networks of information and communication technology that dominates that society. And if you don't have access to that, you are marginalized. You are excluded. So the whole debate about inclusion and exclusion in contemporary society, yes, it's still a class, socio-economic issue, but it's rapidly also becoming an information issue. If you are excluded from that technology, you don't have access to information, to knowledge, to power, to services, and so on and so on. So now comes the worrying figure. As much as you have, up to 96% in some areas, access to cell phones. When I ask the question, who's got access to a computer? The number of them who says no rises to 90%. Major exclusion. So it's one thing to have a phone, but you can still say, and then you can say to me, yes, you can still have access to the internet. Let's ask that question. So the next question is access to internet. The figure is the same. Up in the 80s, high 80% people that don't have access to internet. And that question in census asks at your work, at your home, internet cafe, blah, 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 blah. That is the figure of people that don't have access to internet, that don't have access to computers. That is a serious part of exclusion, of marginalization. And so I want to say to Vodacom, hey, let's get clever now. Can we not find a way of promoting your business in the northern areas in such a way that you link your product to access to internet and to computers? Let's get innovative and creative about it. We're already starting to get ideas, and there's amazing international work that has already been done in this regard. How you can use different types of information and communication technology to give people access to education, to give them access to the arts and culture, to give them access to all those kinds of things that come with the benefit of being connected.
So you must mention this issue is a big issue in South Africa, and I think what we also need to is that more consumer activism. You can have a cell phone, even smartphone. Look at how high our data costs are in this country.
Yeah.
Even access to banking and saving.
Yeah.
It costs you money to save in this country. So banking and the salary industry is actually pro-rich and against the poor.
You can't solve that problem with a cell phone. You don't have to have a laptop or a desktop computer. That's for the moment what I've got to share with you. I just gave you a bit of an insight into why I regard information as so incredibly important in our society. It's of equal significance as political power, if not more. That's my point. And why I think we need to utilize the information that is available to us. We need to get to know what's available to us. And then we've got to become savvy in terms of using it, in terms of applying it in the different contexts in which we make our living and live our lives. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Prof Deon, for a informative, most enlightening, interesting talk that is quite complex but made understandable to us locally human beings. So I'm going to allow you to just address the questions directly.
Absolutely. Please go for it.
Yeah, you started off by saying how our politics is dominating our lives, you know.
Yes.
But if you look at politics is supposed to be a risky story because you only get 4 years in our setup here. So we politics, because somehow people want to, although they're dissatisfied, they can't see themselves not doing the other thing.
Yes.
But we don't realize it's only for 4 years. So if I give you a chance for 4 years, you make a, why can't I choose him for the next 4 years? But we tend to go on.
We invest so much of our confidence in people
Because
with a relatively short term
it's just a
objective.
4-year term you get. So
Politics, after all, is about power. Power can so easily become self-centered power. So we must become more streetwise and less naive about politics in South Africa. We are too naive about power and politics. If you look at what happens with power politics in other countries of the world, you see that when it comes to election time, there are many countries in the world where very, very few people go and vote because the other systems have kicked in. There's checks and balances, and you've got a complex set of other agencies in society. We're not all looking at the government, at the political party to save us. We have become proactive citizens that create our own organizations and don't wait on the government to do it for us. We are not anti-government. We say government, yes, there are certain very important things that you need to do. You need to look at our foreign affairs, you need to look at our military and so on. But you cannot do everything.
because we actually should run away from politics, because it's a bad career. Who wants to have a job for 4 years and then you might be sitting without the job?
Exactly. And that's why you
But
have
if
4
you want to
years.
do your own politics,
Yes, sir.
Yeah. It's very interesting what you said. Attaining the politicians. To my knowledge, this in South Africa, these guys don't care about the people. A lot of money is wasting. Wasting is shocking. For one example, a building at Shoreville spent 1 to 2 billion rand, and it stands empty for 2 years.
Many examples.
It's shocking.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, what I'm saying there, I was involved in ward committees. That's 60 ward committees. I was one of the ward committees in Ward 10. I think you didn't mention Ward 10 and Ward 9 and Ward 12. But I'm staying in Ward 10. My involvement there is not to join any political party, but because of the need of our people. I'm involved in the people for more than 60 years. And I'm still involved. I'm still busy. And you said one truth tonight. And I call on the leaders. I say the leaders, so-called church leaders, to come out of obscurity, come into the fore and be counted. Because if we see what is going on in the government, you know, they taught us about computers for 3 weeks. And then they found out too much money. Instead of empower these people, these 60 wards, people, 10 at every ward, 10 people at every ward. They can empower these people. What would have done? These people could have do a lot of things for our own people.
Can I tell you what's very interesting in terms of what you're saying? I have sent out a pamphlet to each and every of the 60 ward councillors to provide them with this information. I invited them to make use of this information. Monday, they were out for a week. I had one response by Monday. And one political party has now, I sent it to all, okay? I'm not picking any preferences, I'm saying, all of you, I'm saying to you, if you want to know, if you want to win your award, you've got to know your award.
Yes.
And I can provide you with that information. They're not forthcoming. One of them have said they want to make an appointment with me for next Wednesday. They want to see whether I can add value to the information.
You know what?
We'll talk to them. But I'm telling you, the ward, the politicians don't value information. Sadly.
I just want to say something. I actually asked one of the ward councillors, I won't mention which ward. I said to him, sir, I pass your office every day, morning and night. I never see you there. It's always locked up.
Yeah.
He looked at me and said, I will never waste my time listening to people's nonsense stories. To my face with witnesses.
Sure.
And that place is pathetic. I'm not going to mention, you know.
But that's not unique. It's not unique. It's not unique. And I'm not anti the councillors and anti the politicians, but putting so much of our confidence in them is just
Pastor Jabez, and then Pastor Nathan, and
I
then.
was going to say that means we have an ignorant council.
We do.
Because whatever you do, doesn't he understand that whatever you do with information? And how can he be a good counsellor without information? That means most of the things that he's doing, he's assuming.
It's assumptions, and I'm saying the currency is political
That's
currency.
dangerous.
I had a ward councillor of one of the Motherwell wards, who happens to be a minister in the Anglican Church, participated in some of the work, and he was in my office with other people, and I said to him, what's your ward? Give me your ward number. And I went into my database, and I put up his ward, and I said to him, there's your ward. He was flabbergasted. He's never seen that information. He said to me, where is this information? I said to him, you know what? I did this work for the Metro. Have they not given it to you?
But you see, I think because they don't understand your job in society. That's what it is. They don't understand what social development studies are. They don't understand.
Right.
And you give people insight into information that is going on out there, which none of us knew that Vodacom is not prevalent in the northern areas. None of us knew. But it's a business opportunity.
Oh yeah, that's it.
The information you gave us now, I was sitting there, I was thinking, I better run before Billy.